desolate, isolated town nestled between dark forests. A string of gruesome murders began in the dead of night. The killer, known only as the Whispering Killer, left behind victims who appeared to have been slowly suffocated by something invisible, their faces frozen in terror, with strange bruises forming on their necks. Locals reported hearing faint whispers on the wind in the hours leading up to each murder, and many claimed to have heard their names whispered just before the killings occurred. Each victim had a different story: a retired schoolteacher, a young couple in love, an old war veteran, but they all shared the same eerie fate. The whispers had haunted them just before their deaths. The whispers grew louder with each murder, the victims' faces becoming increasingly distorted with fear. As the town spiraled into panic, everyone suspected the killer was someone close, maybe even someone they trusted. One night, a young girl named Lily was alone at home when she heard a whispering voice from behind her bedroom door. It called her name. Frozen with fear, Lily summoned every ounce of courage and whispered back,
"I know who you are."
To her horror, the whisper responded,
"You're next."
The next day, Lily's body was discovered in the woods, but unlike the others, her eyes weren't filled with fear. They were wide open, staring into the distance, as if seeing something beyond the mortal world. The townsfolk had uncovered the horrific truth. The Whispering Killer was no human at all, but the restless spirit of the town's long-dead founder, whose pact with a dark entity had bound him to the town and its inhabitants. Elliot had a mundane life, working at a bland office job. One evening, after a long day at work, he returned home to find a small, intricately carved box on his doorstep. Inside was a doll with an unsettling smile, its eyes too lifelike. There was no note, no clue as to who could have left it. A week later, another box appeared. This one contained a lock of hair, black as night, with a note that read, "Your turn will come." At first, Elliot thought the boxes were a prank, perhaps from a neighbor with a twisted sense of humor. But as the items inside became more personal and horrifying, a set of fingerprints pressed into clay, a scrap of a victim's bloody shirt, Elliot began to panic. He researched the boxes and learned of the collector, a serial killer whose ritual was to take something from each of his victims before their deaths, preserving their most intimate belongings. The killer would leave behind a box for each one, each containing a part of the victim's soul. As Elliot tried to distance himself, a third box appeared with a photo of him, looking out from his bedroom window, clearly unaware that someone had been watching him for days. The note inside read,
"I've been waiting. You're the next piece."
He tried to call the police, but when they arrived, Elliot was gone. His apartment was left in complete disarray, and a final box sat on his bed, containing nothing but a shard of his own reflection, the last part of him to be collected. Hannah had just finished a late shift at the diner and was walking home, the night air growing chilly. She cut through a narrow alley, knowing it would be faster than the main road. It was there she first saw him, a tall, gaunt man standing under a flickering streetlight. He wore an old-fashioned suit and had a wide grin plastered across his face, as though he were in on some joke that no one else could understand. At first, she thought it was a figment of her imagination, maybe a trick of the dim lighting or an eccentric passerby. But when she glanced over her shoulder a moment later, the man hadn't moved. His grin was even wider. Hannah's pulse quickened as she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. She began walking faster, but the man's footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. Every time she turned a corner, he was right there, always keeping pace, never speaking, just smiling that awful grin. Panicked, she broke into a run. But no matter how fast she moved, the man stayed close, always just a few steps behind. Her breath came in ragged gasps, as she reached her apartment building. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart racing. But when she peeked through the window, there he was, across the street, standing motionless, his grin still wide and unchanging. That was when she learned the truth. The smiling man had been linked to a series of unsolved murders. All of his victims had been found with their faces twisted into grotesque, unnaturally wide grins, their expressions frozen in terror. Hannah thought she was safe, but as she lay in bed that night, she felt the creeping sensation that she was being watched. She turned to see the shadow of a figure in her doorway, his smile too wide to be human. In the bustling city of Blackridge, there were whispers of a killer known as the Silent Watcher. He wasn't known for his brutality or his rapid killings, but for his unsettling ability to appear out of nowhere and stalk his victims for weeks before striking. The Silent Watcher was different. His victims were never chosen at random. He observed them, learning their routines, their habits, until they never suspected the danger. He never spoke, never made a sound as he followed them through the streets, across parks, and into their homes. The killer's greatest power was the fear of the unknown. People who had lived in Blackridge their whole lives reported an increasing unease as they went about their daily routines. They would glance over their shoulders, sure they saw someone lurking in the background. But when they looked again, the figure was gone. Many believed that the Silent Watcher was a ghost or some kind of mythical being, but one thing was certain: his victims never saw him coming. Sarah, a young woman who had recently moved to Blackridge, grew suspicious of the eerie feeling that had gripped the city. Late one night, she heard a faint sound, a soft breathing, so quiet she almost didn't catch it. She spun around, but the street was empty. The sound continued, as if right behind her, but when she turned again, there was nothing. The Silent Watcher was there, his presence suffocating her. But she couldn't see him, only feel the cold breath against her neck, the unseen gaze that followed her every move. The next day, Sarah's body was discovered, her eyes wide in terror, her mouth slightly open in what seemed like a scream, but there was no sound. The Silent Watcher had come for her, and no one ever heard his steps. Max was a self-proclaimed true crime enthusiast who often found solace in the twisted tales of serial killers. One evening, while browsing a dark web forum dedicated to unsolved cases, he received an anonymous message.
I know you love the stories, but do you want to be part of one?
At first, Max thought it was just another prank, until he received a second message.
I'm already watching you.
The messages kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. The anonymous sender, calling themselves the Stalker, began sending Max detailed descriptions of his day-to-day life, even things Max hadn't shared online. The killer had infiltrated his personal world, watching him like a puppet on strings. The Stalker's game was simple: solve the riddles or face the consequences. Each day, Max received a new cryptic puzzle. The stakes became higher with each one. If Max failed to solve the riddle in time, the Stalker would send him another horrifying message, sometimes accompanied by a gruesome photo of a victim in a twisted pose. As the puzzles grew more complicated, Max became obsessed with figuring them out. He had no choice. The killer had made it clear. The game was real, and the winner would survive. The final riddle arrived one night, with a dire warning.
Solve it, or I'll take you.
Max, exhausted and paranoid, thought he had figured it out just in time. But as he reached the last clue, he heard a soft sound behind him, a whisper, too faint to catch at first. When he turned around, the Stalker was there, standing just beyond the door, his face obscured by shadows, grinning as he said,
You are the last piece.
The game had ended, and Max had lost. Thanks for watching the video. Please make sure to live like and subscribe if you want more of ChatGPT and real stories. And at the end, sleep tight and be careful out there.